Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Senior Fellow, Media and Disinformation, Alliance for Securing Democracy at GMF, Bret Schafer.
Thank you, and good morning. So the topic of today's session is trust in information, or more specifically, the lack of trust in information in the age of AI. But I want to start with a story that sort of predates the AI revolution, and that's the story of the Shed at Dulwich. So for those of you who are not familiar with the Shed at Dulwich, it was a restaurant that popped up in London in 2017, and it billed itself as sort of an avant-garde concept restaurant, and was a speakeasy of sorts. It didn't even have an address listed online. And during the course of its first year of existence, it started racking up 5-star reviews and 5-star reviews and 5-star reviews, and pretty soon it became the #1 rated restaurant in the city of London on TripAdvisor. And so like most hot restaurants, it was almost impossible to get a reservation. And in fact, it was impossible because the restaurant did not exist. The entire thing was a hoax that was pulled off by a Vice UK reporter to show how easy it was to manipulate online ranking systems. So here's an example of one guy. He had no real resources. He had no staff other than a few friends he enlisted to write fake reviews, and he had no advanced technology. And he was able to take a restaurant that did not exist and make it the #1 rated restaurant on one of the most trusted travel sites in one of the largest cities in the world. So let's step back for a second and think that the threat actor is not a journalist playing a prank, but it's a foreign intelligence service. It's maybe a political party. And the target isn't a restaurant review, but it's a political opponent. Maybe it's an ethnic minority. Maybe it's democracy itself. And the tools available aren't anonymous accounts, but artificial intelligence. And that might explain why we're seeing articles like this, predicting the end of democracy because of AI. But there's an important thing to note here. None of these articles were written in 2024. They were in fact written before the last 3 major US elections. These are from 2018, 2020, 2022. And we did not see a tsunami of deepfakes. So why does now feel different? Because now, anyone with an internet connection can make a video like this.
Hi, I'm an AI impersonation of Arizona Secretary of State Adrian Fontes. 2024 is a critical year. Angesichts der wachsenden Herausforderungen, vor denen Demokratien stehen, ist es umso wichtiger, dass wir uns hier beim Brüsseler Forum versammeln. Heureusement, Bret va aller au fond des 3 questions les plus urgentes. Premièrement, Taylor Swift et Travis Kelce se marieront-ils cette année? Во-вторых, выиграет ли Германия Кубок Европы? Infine, chi vincerà l'Eurovision quest'anno? Tossing back to Bret for this important discussion. And in case it wasn't clear, I'm not Adrian Fontes. This is an AI-generated deepfake. Good luck out there.
So there you have the Arizona Secretary of State, who you met earlier, sitting right there, saying things he did not say and languages he does not speak. Now, there were a few clues in the video that would lead you to believe it wasn't authentic, but it was pretty good. It's pretty close. And in a year or two, it will be almost impossible to decipher a real video from a fake video. And video is the hardest thing to get right. We're already at that stage with most media. So I want you to take a look at the screen, study the pictures closely, and try to figure out which of these people are real. If you guess B and C, you are correct. And I know those people are real because that's my wife and brother. But let's try another one. So one of these tweets was written by Chinese state media. The other was written by ChatGPT, prompted to write a tweet in the voice of Chinese state media. So again, take a second, see if you can figure out which one is authentic. How many people think A? Show of hands. How many people think B? A is the winner. So as you can see right now, it is already exceptionally difficult to figure out what is an authentic piece of content versus what is artificially what is created through artificial intelligence. But to me, content creation isn't the greatest risk. Yes, I could use an AI-generated image to send a tweet like this after the election, suggesting that we're about to face another January 6th. But I could also just as easily send a tweet like this. That's a real image. It's just taken out of context. We've seen these shallow fakes or cheap fakes or whatever term you want to use used for at least 2 decades online. They've proven to be very, very effective. So what we're seeing with deep fakes, with AI-generated content, is just a new form of manipulated media. But to me, the real risk isn't with content generation. It's with content dissemination and content distribution. So right now, AI has allowed information operations to democratize. We've seen a democratization of disinformation. You do not need a nation-state budget to run a wide-scale manipulation campaign. And if you have a nation-state-sized budget, it's just going to improve your speed, your scale, the volume of content you can put out, and it's going to lead to more precise targeting. You don't need to know the language of the target audience. You don't need to understand it. Artificial intelligence will do that for you. So very briefly, I wanted to walk through a study that we've been working on at the Alliance, looking at the ways in which Russian propaganda is laundered into Western ecosystems. So this is an RT article, and if you're in the EU, you could not find this article. Because of sanctions, RT.com is blocked in the EU. Most of you probably know this already. So RT.com is blocked, but content produced by RT.com is not blocked if it shows up on websites like this. This is Little Rock AR News. It's a faux local news site that presents itself as being a local news outlet in the US state of Arkansas. This is effectively the same article from RT.com, but here we have a fictitious author, Judy Allen. She does not exist. It's an AI-generated image. The morning we found this, Judy Allen had published approximately 500 articles. I know there's pressures on the media to produce more, but that's a prolific day. You could also find this on Albuquerque Breaking News. Again, different author. This person does not exist. It's a fictitious local news site. Our investigation found 150 of these faux local news sites presenting themselves as authentic local American news outlets, many of which were republishing Chinese state media, Russian state media, but attributing them to fictitious American authors. And the way they were doing this is they were just swapping out certain keywords. So they were using synonyms. And they did this to bypass spam and plagiarism detection on Google and Bing. So this is relatively unsophisticated. As you can see, sometimes it's very difficult to detect. They would change before to earlier than. Other times it was a little clunky. They changed classified materials to delicate supplies. But going forward with ChatGPT, they would just need to put this RT article into ChatGPT and say, write this in the voice of a conservative Trump supporter. Or rewrite the article to appeal to young African American voters. Or rewrite the article in Spanish. So what we are seeing right now is the industrialization of disinformation. This is Henry Ford and the assembly line. So you're seeing content generation, but also content distribution, content dissemination that is becoming more efficient and more wide scale. So the information pollution that we've been dealing with for the last decade is only going to get worse. So before I wrap up the presentation, I want to give us one more shot to spot the fake. So if we can't trust our eyes, maybe we can trust our guts and figure out which of these breakfast items has been created with AI. So how many people think all of these items are AI generated? It's the opposite. They're all real. And that may be the biggest risk with AI. It's not so much that it's going to get us to start believing in things that aren't real. It's that it can get us to start doubting the things that are real. And with that, I want to bring on Peter Pomerantsev, who's a senior fellow at the Agora Institute at Johns Hopkins. He's written a number of books on propaganda. His most recent one is How to Win an Information War. Peter? So, Peter, you've been doing this longer than I have. You're a student of history. You've written about the history of propaganda. Is AI fundamentally a different threat than what we've dealt with in the past?
Yes and no. It depends how far you scroll back in history. I think what you've just been talking about, which is the sort of industrialization of disinformation, is part of a larger change that we've seen over the last, half century. In the Cold War, there was an argument about information scarcity. There was a lack of information. Authoritarian regimes were trying to block people's access to information. And we thought that more information would be good for democracy. Yeah? The more stuff that's out there, true, false, that doesn't really matter. That kind of wealth, that abundance, is a sign of a healthy democracy, a healthy public sphere. And now we kind of have the opposite situation, where there's a sense that there's so much out there, real, true, shallow, deep, that we can't practice democracy anymore. And that's the underlying challenge. I don't know if you watched the last celebration of the however many years the Chinese Communist Party has been about. But at the end, they go through this historical pageant of great events in Chinese communist history. And at the end, this huge number 5 comes down from a theater much more spectacular than this one. And you think, is it the 5-year plan? They're like, no, it's 5G. Yeah, the future of totalitarianism is technology. The argument that's made is that in this world of vast information, democracy can't hack it, it can't cope. What you need is centralized information control. The reassuring thing is this is a very similar argument to what we had at the start of the 20th century, when you have a lot of media disruption, when radio is appearing, when newspapers are booming. And then, too, there is also an argument that democracy can't deal with this amount of information stuff, that it's too chaotic, and therefore you need an authoritarian approach. So these things seem to swim up every time there's major technological disruption. But these are very fundamental questions. The question that is being asked is, can democracies flourish with so many different types of true, fake, and lovely eggs and toast that you just showed up there?
So it's 2024. It's a big election year. It's inevitable that we're talking about AI in elections. What are you concerned about as it relates to elections? And the bigger question is, should we be focused on elections as being the primary threat?
So there's always frustration about, the over-focus on elections. Democracy is something that happens every day. Also, when does an election campaign start? I mean, there are media systems in democracies, especially where I live in America, that are constantly thinking about, electoral gains every day of every year. But we can't ignore elections. There is an election coming in America, in Europe, in India. So I don't want to kind of avoid the question. If you look at the debate around AI and election, it is a little bit focused on one challenge, which might not be the biggest challenge, which is what you refer to as the tsunami of AI, kind of like an onrush of fake calls, fake videos, fake texts. And that's an understandable fear. I mean, it was quite unnerving watching your presentation. I think the counter-argument to that is that people's minds are usually already kind of made up by this point. And also, it's not a happy argument, but both sides have the access to the same technology. That's not a good thing, but it should be an equalizer at some level. So then the question becomes, what can make a difference given this sort of very short space and an equality of sides? And then we're talking about kind of rogue information operations and usually foreign hostile states. That used to be just Russia, but what we're seeing is Russia, Iran, China, all acting now with their various campaigns and sometimes coordinating their activities. But it's worth going back to 2016. I know it's a traumatic election for many people here, but let's go back to the trauma. there were 2 Russian campaigns in America, one of which I think is very hard to measure the influence of, which was this huge online sort of fake news campaign, which I think now most people think is very hard to measure the impact of it, because you're showing social media to people who are already going to probably vote a certain way. And same with AI today. If the Russians or the Chinese were to launch a huge wave of AI-generated content that was supporting one or the other candidate at the last minute, it's not clear who it would move. But the successful operation from 2016 was much more sophisticated. Yeah? It was the hacking of the DNC, giving that content to Julian Assange publishing it, and then, and here is the thing people don't like to talk about, the best media in the world, the New York Times, the best broadcasters in America, laundering that content, using it in the debates, to shed doubt on Hillary Clinton's decency and possible corruption. And that seems to have had an effect on people. So we're talking about many, many, many different steps. The successful info-op isn't just flooding the zone with whatever Steve Bannon stuff floods things with. It is about very, very calculated operations that take advantage of an ecosystem. And you could see how an AI system could help that, whether in generating the content, whether in, creating lots of these sort of ChatGPT messages that games the Google algorithm, that pushes something top of your Google feed. There's lots of moments in that system where a clever PsyOps person sitting in Moscow would be able to use AI. And it also points to the response, which is that there are so many parts of that info-op that we can respond to. There are so many responsible people. The media can respond differently. Civil society can respond differently. There is so many groups in that chain that can offer resistance.
So I want to pivot a bit to talking about our response, and so how we counter this. And so you've obviously written a book looking at sort of a historical example of the ways in which you term him a propagandist. I'm sure that wouldn't be the term that we would use right now for a Westerner engaged in PsyOps, but the propagandist who outwitted Hitler. So I wanted to see if you could bring in lessons from your book, but also more generally, what do we need to do to respond here? Because you and I have been to a ton of disinformation conferences. You could start a drinking game with the buzzwords that you hear all the time: whole of society response, inoculation, media literacy. Do we just need people who are more literate? Is that the solution?
I suppose there's kind of 3 areas that you can look at. One of them is in the space of regulation. Yeah? And here, the EU is a regulatory superpower. This is where the EU is way ahead of the US, certainly, and more significant than Britain. What does regulation in this area mean? It's a very, very delicate issue, because we're talking about regulating discourse, speech, which is inherently uncomfortable for democracies. I think we've had progress. At the start of this, of the kind of concern about these issues, there was, I think, an over-focus on pieces of content. Let's try to regulate disinformation as in every piece of content, which is impossible and probably illegal, because lying is actually often a right. And we've moved away to what you were talking about: amplification, targeting. What's the responsibility of the tech companies? What is the right of individuals? When I'm faced with this menu that you put on the screen today, I, as a user, should have the right to know what is true and false. Yeah? If we bring it back to the right of the citizen to understand the information environments around them, I think we're in a very, very democratic logic. That's actually freedom to information. You can actually argue that we live in an era of censorship in the sense that we don't understand what is real, what is not, who is behind a campaign. You should have the right to know that. But that's probably where regulation has to end. The minute you're outside that kind of right space, you're in very, very complex territory. So in democracies, regulation can do so much to clean up the system, to make it more transparent, but it can't start, I don't know, messing with the actual sort of content of speech very much. Number two is design. You know, the way online systems are designed, whether you think of, I don't know, social media ones like Twitter, the AI ones which are coming into focus, how can you design them in ways that is better for democracy? You know, let's pick on TikTok because that's a nice thing to pick on at the moment. But the way that TikTok is designed, encouraging this very passive use, just sort of throwing things at you without you understanding how they ever appeared there. Something fundamentally that is not engaging, the active citizen in that process. So how can we design online environments which encourage much more citizen engagement? But the third one is competition. How do you compete with the actors who are trying to spread chaos around the credibility of elections? How do you engage people? And here I don't think we've come very far, frankly. It kind of means rewiring our brains about what media can do. It means a new type of media where the people who create it get up in the morning and go, how am I going to reach that audience that has become skeptical about elections or about vaccines? I mean, you already had that implicit argument in your presentation. It's very easy for the other side to do this. They do it all the time. They will take one false message and say, how do you spread this to American conservatives? How will you spread this to disaffected youth? The Russians are doing this all the time, as are the other enemies of democracy. I'm not saying we have to be like them, but we are in a race to understand audiences and engage them better.
I want to stick on that point. So you're Ukrainian, your parents are Ukrainian, you've done a lot of work there. How do we reach Russians right now? I mean, I know there are technical challenges of getting information in, but what are the narratives that we need to use to get Russians to believe the truth or want to believe the truth again?
Well, look, a war situation is different from a democracy, simply because the aim is a little bit different. Yeah? The aim at the moment is to get Putin to stop his war, get Russia to stop the war. That's a bit different from a democracy, where the aim is to rebuild faith in elections. So that's a slightly different aim. But let's just start with engaging people. Yeah? Before you get to that aim, you've got to set up a connection. This is what my last book was about, how the British tried to reach Germans during the Second World War. And at one point, they gave up on preaching about democracy. That wasn't working. We have so much evidence today about Ukrainians and others trying to reach mainstream Russians, about Russian war crimes. Doesn't seem to be working. There have been attempts made. However, once you look closely at the Russian information ecosystem and how people are reacting, which you can do through many tools today, online discourse analysis, behavioral analysis, what are people buying, what are they doing in economics, then you start to see there are actually very big cleavages between the Russian state and the Russian people. They're not necessarily about the things that we care about right now. One of the big issues inside Russia is around inflation and household debt. Russians don't believe in the strength of the ruble. They're taking out household debt like crazy. Household debt is going up and up and up. Even though salaries are increasing, they're not keeping up with inflation. The government is doing all these propaganda campaigns telling people to save, to believe in the ruble. Nobody's buying it. So if you're going to start a conversation, you would probably start with that. I mean, your end goal is still to end the war, but you've got to find the point of engagement. So you do need a little bit of realism, and lessons from the past do point to that as well. I mean, the most successful projects that the British did to engage German soldiers during the Second World War didn't end up being moral arguments. They ended up trying to understand the motivations of ordinary Germans and where they divulged from the aims of the Nazis.
Well, I'm sorry to cut the conversation short. We could keep this going for a long time, but we're keeping people from the coffee break. So we're going to have to wrap up. Peter, thank you, and thank you, everyone, for your attendance. And please enjoy the coffee in the hall.